we are very privileged to have again, as you said, David, Professor Jonathan Gershoni, and he will have the wonderful task to address tonight this very important question. Are we nearing the end? For sure, it's about the COVID-19 health crisis and try to see what's happened this year and perhaps more important to look ahead to what would be the year 2021. We expect a lot from this year, and all of us, because of the vaccine and everything, we will speak about with Professor Gershoni, with Jonathan now. So before having the Q&A with our very important audience tonight, I would like to introduce with a few questions, Professor. And the first one will be with the new year coming up, looking back to what was the year 2020. What are, according to you, the most important lessons learned about COVID-19 we should keep in mind for a better 2021?
Well, first of all, it's once again a pleasure to be here, and it's a bit symbolic to have opened up the discussions way back in March and find ourselves with deeper understanding, I would believe, and perspectives regarding the epidemic, the pandemic. There are certainly a number of points that we have learned. Unfortunately, one conclusion is I don't think people, certainly in Israel and in other places, were as well behaved and obedient as we should be. I think we've all undergone a trauma. We've had to accept that viruses can have a profound impact on our day-to-day life, and we can't negotiate with viruses as well. And whereas we've seen demonstrations and objection and quite extensive events and behaviors of people trying to basically get on with life and to some degree not comply with sensible, safe behavior, we've seen the consequences. So I don't want to be flippant and say, you know, everything is great. Aryeh, you just recently said that you can sum up your year in 2 words, good and not good. So maybe, as I tend to be very optimistic, and I hope during the course of this discussion to come up with more positive perspectives, one thing I think that we do have to seriously accept is that, at least in Israel and in other governments, there have been sincere efforts in trying to behave and to delineate policies that make the most professional sense. And we've been confronted with contradictory political considerations that have made the handling of the pandemic very complex, very difficult. And I think it's only human nature. So if we've learned one thing, is that these are not easily solved problems. Logic doesn't always prevail. There are very complex, conflicting considerations. I think that many of us have all of a sudden had to realize that the impact on our children, and in my case, my grandchildren, has been very serious. Having 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds stay at home endlessly, curiously developing a strong desire to go back to school is paradoxical, but I think we're going to all have to deal with the consequences of what is a world global pandemic. None of us have actually experienced a pandemic to such size and its impact. And all of this together has made it a huge challenge. Now, I started actually on the more somber tone, in not sort of easing over and saying, oh, you know, the future is glorious. Although I do believe that we have learned a huge amount about not only policies and human behavior and public health and virology and immunology. Almost every single one of you has learned some lesson about spike proteins, RNA, and antibodies, and people come up with very good questions and ask me very provocative issues. And so it's been a very, very complex year. However, and this may actually been recorded, I don't remember, but if I was asked in March and a year ago, where would we be? I don't think we would have been at such a promising situation as of December 2020. So in all of my capacity to try to anticipate how much progress would we make, and would we be able to be at a point we're on the verge of enormous campaigns of vaccination with a technology that, to be completely and totally honest, I was a bit skeptical. Not that I didn't have confidence in the technology, but I felt that, you know, this may not prove to be as efficient as it has proven to be. So with everything I've said thus far, I would have to admit that I'm very optimistic. I think we're on the verge of taking the next step towards seriously trying to deal with the pandemic. There's still a long haul. People, I do not think, fully understand the enormity, the magnitude of what we're still having to do. When in Israel, people are talking about the fact that 250,000 people have already been vaccinated, and much of the public and the politicians tend to make comments as if, here, we're just about, you know, give it a few more days, we're okay. They don't realize that 250,000 vaccinations in Israel is still a drop in the bucket. We have to reach at least 60% coverage. And if we are talking about a country of 9 million people, so we're going to have to cover 6 million. And I think that we're going to see that this is not an easy challenge. So I think we've learned a lot, and we are also in a position where we can be optimistic, because I think 2021 is going to be definitely a much better year.
So let's speak a little bit more about the vaccine, as you said. And I would like to say to our audience that they can ask the question on the chat box. And after the few questions that I have to introduce, as I said, they will be able to ask themselves the question if they want. If not, Pascaline will do it for them. So about the vaccine, it's unprecedented. It's the first time that it's possible to create a vaccine in so short period. It's less than 1 year, and so there are many questions about this vaccine developed by Pfizer and Moderna and other company. First, are they safe? Because we hear a lot of things about that. Are they safe? First question.
So a quick answer is yes. But let me, of course, elaborate. I think that generally people don't understand the full process. There is a paper that came out a while ago, and the title of the paper is 3 decades of development of messenger RNA vaccines. That is the title, meaning that the development of this technology that people perceive to be totally new has been in the works and being developed for 30 years. Now, the real punchline to this paper is it was submitted for publication in March 2019. So what we're actually saying is that this technology has been developed since 1989, and this
You.
Open it again. Can you hear me now?
Yes, it's okay. And I will ask all the audience to keep mute, please, because if not, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay. So I don't know
Go on.
when I became muted, but what I'm saying is that there was an article published called 3 Decades of Development of Messenger RNA Vaccines, illustrating that what many people presume to be a revolutionary novel technology. It's been in the works for now 30 years, since 1989. And the particular paper I'm referring to was submitted for publication in March of 2019, which is 9 months before COVID-19. So whereas I think people misunderstand, they believe that in view of the COVID-19 emergence, a new technology was developed and brought to fruition to a functional vaccine within a year. This simply is not true. The technology has been in the works for 30 years. Now, even more, if you think about BioNTech, the company that developed and then merged with Pfizer, and Moderna, both of these companies were established 10 years ago, before there was a COVID-19. And they were established with the mission of implementing RNA vaccines as a new technology, as a new modality. So in many respects, everything was in the works and being developed and prepared. And so it isn't a case where within the last year we've come up with this brilliant idea. Messenger RNA as a platform for vaccination and as a therapeutic was well established before the emergence of COVID-19. Now, you're absolutely right that the normal timeline in the development of a vaccine has typically taken years. However, I would say the stars are in the right constellation, because with this technology that had never been implemented as a public health tool, it was ripe. It was just pristinely correct to be tested in this massive global pandemic. Think about it. In the years we were trying to develop a vaccine for HIV/AIDS, SIDA, we failed, and today we're still failed. But in the clinical trials, just the recruitment of 6,000 participants for an AIDS vaccine trial took a few years to get enough people willing to participate. And then it took 3 years to accumulate enough cases so as to generate a statistically significant result, unfortunately illustrating that the vaccine trial failed. Here, we're talking about a situation where hundreds of thousands of people are infected daily in the United States, thousands of people in Israel, and tens of thousands over Europe in each country individual. So to recruit for Moderna 30,000 participants and 44,000 for Pfizer was uniquely the result of having this massive global pandemic. Has nothing to do with the technology, has nothing to do with the bureaucracy, but everything to do with the fact that there has been a very, very, very high infectious rate. And so people are eager to participate and contribute to the development of the vaccine. And then within a half a year, enough cases had accumulated so as to illustrate the efficacy with statistical significance. And so there have been many different parameters and conditions which have all come together in order to prove that when everything fits, you can run the whole process within a year. There was another aspect, and that is, of course, the finance. No company would be willing to undertake developing a vaccine without taking each one of the steps separately. conducting a phase 1 clinical trial, evaluating the data, and when you're convinced, go to the second stage, phase 2, and then phase 3. The US government took a huge, huge risk and said, you know what, it's on me. You guys run the experiments and do everything in parallel. Don't wait for the results. We will take the risk. We will help you in developing it in parallel. And then a third component was the US government gave clear instructions to the FDA in saying, you know what, this is our first priority. What normally would be analyzed as per the position in the stack, in the pile of files, everything to do with COVID-19, the warp speed program, Operation Warp Speed, all of this was done so that the FDA made an active effort to work with the companies and work in parallel. The concept of checking out the manufacturing pipeline and the facilities before a phase 3 has even been completed is unheard of. But everything was done in advance with the greatest level of efficiency. So we are witness to a rare moment in the history of vaccines. We're proving that if everything comes together, the process can take a year. Now, I know that some of my friends in the industry are not very happy about this, because now the expectations are going to be for future emerging diseases, maybe not as catastrophic as COVID-19, but everybody's going to say, well, why don't you do what you did for COVID-19? Let's get it done within a year. And this is unreasonable. And so we are fortunate that there was a concerted effort around the world with the economies and so forth to get it done. And the reality is yes, it was completed. Were corners cut for safety? The answer is definitively no. No corners were cut. Everything was just done efficiently, taking all the financial risk by the government and implementing technologies that have been in the works for 30 years. So I understand the enormous recognition and enthusiasm and excitement about it, as well as the concern. Are we confronted with something that hasn't been sufficiently tested? But my personal feeling is that it is safe. It is far more efficient than anybody had anticipated. We have no idea if it will be durable and robust, but I think we're on a very good track of realizing a new technology and possibly a revolution in the development of vaccines for the future.
Thank you. So it's safe, and you recommend that everybody that could be vaccinated should do it. It's clear.
Without a doubt, and I would say even more than that. If you have the opportunity to be vaccinated with a given vaccine, let's say Pfizer, as in my case, do not wait for Moderna or for another technology. Quite the contrary. I think it is advantageous to all of us to get vaccinated as soon as possible. And if it turns out that it is not as durable and robust as we had hoped, and we need to get a boost next year, so be it.
Okay, so as we are very proud Zionists, we were sure that the first vaccine will be coming from Israel. So we are a little bit upset, as you can understand. But more seriously, do you think that the Israelis are still in the competition to provide a vaccine in the next weeks, months, during the year, something like that? Something will come from Israel, do you think?
Well, first of all, you know that the chief scientific or clinical officer of Moderna is Israeli, Tal Zak, so take pride in that. And the head of Pfizer, I believe, is a Jew from Thessaloniki, and so we can take pride of that. And as to your question, no, we will not be leaders in the development of the vaccine. I think that the effort that is being made currently at the Israel Biological Institute in Ness Ziona is an effort. I personally don't believe that it is the best choice of vaccine modality. And I think one thing that people are going to have to face is with the success of Moderna and Pfizer, this is going to create very serious challenges for the other companies to complete their clinical trials. Whereas the EUA, the emergency use approval in the United States, one of the guidelines is so long as that there's no other alternative. And the reality is now is that there are two approved vaccines, Moderna and Pfizer. Now, they are approved under the EUA, so they're not licensed yet. But I'm assuming that they will be licensed in the reasonably near future. And so you cannot ask for an emergency use approval if there is a viable and an effective alternative. In addition to that, some of the companies that are trying to develop in Israel would be the same. There are going to be many people who are going to be reluctant to participate with the chances of obtaining or being vaccinated, in quotes, with a placebo, when we know that we could be vaccinated with a bona fide vaccine such as Moderna and Pfizer. So this is going to complicate things. So people are going to have to now design clinical trials in which the comparators may not be as straightforward as having a placebo arm and a vaccine arm. And so this is going to make things more difficult. And as the vaccine is implemented, the number of people being infected is going to drop, which is going to extend the time in order to accumulate enough cases to determine efficacy. So it's getting very complicated. And so I know that the Israeli vaccine is now entering phase 2 clinical trial. I don't know where the situation is going to be in, let's say, 4, 5, 6 months. Will they be able to initiate and then complete a phase 3? So it's difficult.
So the COVID-19 crisis is a huge crisis. It's a crisis of what we call the globalization. But also the vaccine is the result of the globalization of the economy and the fact that the capitalistic system made its part to give this opportunity to have a vaccine. But when we speak about globalization, it's always also something that is connected to disinformation, all the conspiracy theory, and everything. Those who are anti-vaccine. And we don't really understand why those people are pushing so far and so hard against the vaccine and against all those medicines that could save the life of people. So when we have to face this conspiracy theory that will have a deep impact on the people, and we see half of the population in Europe don't want to be vaccinated, and I think it's the same in most of the country. So according to you, as a scientific person, what can we do? What the government can do to fight against this theory?
So I agree, and I think that some of the numbers we see now are a bit misleading. Right now, we have 250,000, maybe 300,000 Israelis already vaccinated. And this is, of course, a very significant proportion of our population and quite impressive. However, it has a lot to do with convincing the convinced. I think that the flooding of people actively going out and trying to get vaccinated is a percent of our population which are already convinced and eagerly interested in getting vaccinated. So I think that there's probably about 20-30% of the population which truly wants to get vaccinated as quick as possible. Now, as you mentioned, there may be 10%, let's say, of very adamant anti-vaxxers, either conspiracy theories and so on, and can it cause autism and so on and so forth, and it's the government contriving and it's poisonous and it's the devil. So you have about 10% of those, and we will not convince them. But you have between the 30%, 20% that are eager to get vaccinated, and the 10% which are adamantly against it. You then still have 60% that you have to convince, and you have to convince at least half of them. So I think what has to be done is, first of all, an effort for good education campaigns. There has to be an openness and an honestness. There has to be an illustration of a phase 4 clinical trial. That is to say, follow up and make sure that we monitor whatever adverse events may occur due to vaccination within the people who are now getting vaccinated. And so we have to be able to convince people that it is safe, it is worthwhile, it's not terribly painful or difficult, and it's certainly manageable with optalgine or aspirin if you happen to develop. I did not develop any more serious adverse effects opposed from maybe a slight pain in my shoulder, which within 24 hours was gone. So I think people have to share and explain and encourage. And I think we have to develop positive incentives. So whereas I'm against the concept, do we want to enforce by law vaccination? I think that is wrong. However, on the other hand, do we want to come out with what we've called here in Israel a green passport, some sort of a documentation? I've been vaccinated. And for those who have completed both injections and are vaccinated, they should be privileged in the sense that they have an easier access to board planes, fly, enter other countries, come back to Israel. I think it is our moral responsibility to be more restrictive of people who want to enter the country who have not been vaccinated, as opposed to be more flexible and open to embracing those that have. Now, this is not at all new. During the course of my research, I've visited many countries around the world in various institutes of infectious disease, and there's nothing more natural than when going to Kenya or Uganda or to Thailand and to other countries where they say, if you want to come to our country, you must show that you've been vaccinated against yellow fever or Japanese encephalitis or dysentery or others. And we don't view this as an imposition or an insult to our liberties and rights, but rather this is what the country requires. So if you do not want to go to Kenya, well, that's your prerogative, and you may not have to then get vaccinated. But if you do want to go to Kenya, and of course to visit Masai Mara is touristy, but I go there also to work. And under those circumstances, I'm saying that this is quite reasonable, and I think that having a green passport should be something that is implemented and has real value. And as more people get vaccinated and find that they have a privileged status, this might provide incentive for those who are hesitant. And all we really need to do is get enough of the hesitants into the camp of the vaccinees, and we should be much better off.
So it's a real pleasure having this conversation with you, and I have many questions to ask you, but I know that we have 95 other personality in this audience that would like to ask you some questions. So I will take a few minutes to ask you the 3 last small questions. We heard about the wind of panic coming from UK. It's not about the Brexit. It's about this new variant of the variant of the virus. What can you tell us about this variant? Is it something very harming, important, or something that it's something that we should be, let's say, waiting for that?
I think this is quite natural. Viruses in general, and especially RNA viruses such as corona, have a tendency to undergo mutagenesis as we have more and more infections. So this is something that we have to realize. As more people are getting infected, as the virus is spreading, more commonly it has to replicate. And with each event of replication, there's a greater chance of incorporating viruses, making errors. So as we reduce the infectious rate, we're going to see a slower level of accumulation of mutations. Now, specifically about the Britain, the UK mutation, and the South African is also a mutation which is on everybody's mind. Both of these viruses have specific mutations that have been seen before in the course of the year. The remarkable aspect of these viruses is they seem to have accumulated a number of vaccines together, but there are no unique mutations. If I said vaccines, I was wrong. I meant mutations. These viruses have accumulated mutations that have previously been seen. Now, most notably, there is a mutation in a specific amino acid. I won't go into the details, 501, from asparagine to tyrosine. You don't care. I care, by the way. I find it interesting. But putting the interest aside, this particular vaccine mutation may explain why this new strain of virus or variant tends to infect more effectively, more efficiently. But when you think about mutations, there are three aspects that you have to consider. The first aspect is, does it in fact cause a more efficient rate of infection? And I think the answer here for both the South African and the UK mutation is that they seem to have a more accelerated efficiency for infection. But the second point is, does this make it more dangerous? Does it cause a more severe disease? And there are no indications that these variations in these strains are any more pathological, causing more disease than the Wuhan versions from 2019. And then the third question, and this is what I think is on most people's mind, is with the appearance of these various mutations, does this mean that these viruses are going to be more resilient and evade the effect and the efficiency of the vaccine? And in my mind, absolutely not. I may be wrong, I hope not, but in critically evaluating the atomic structure of the viral protein and the positions of the mutations, I think that they are academically interesting and not worrisome at all with respect to the efficacy of the vaccines that exist and the mutations that have emerged. So I feel very comfortable about it, and I'm not terribly concerned.
So I will ask my two last questions in the same question. The first one will be, are we condemned to live the next year with the mask? Because we are now used to use the mask everywhere. And I'm afraid that it will be the next norm for everybody and everywhere and always to use the mask. And my second question, do you think that we will go back to what we call normal, or should we imagine what could be a new normal? How do you see these two problems, the mask and the returning to the normal, or something that should be the new normality?
Sure. So first of all, with regard to the mask, for the moment, we don't know. The reason being is that we understand that the vaccine can prevent the development of disease, but we do not have convincing evidence as yet that it prevents infection. Now, for the average individual, this seems a contradiction in terms, but it isn't. If our immune system is effective in preventing the development of the pathological situation, the disease, then that's great. And we know that that is the efficacy that was monitored and measured. And we know that we are 95% efficient with both Moderna and Pfizer in blocking the development of the disease in the vaccinee. However, the tissues in our upper respiratory system, the lungs and our throat, nose, and so forth, these tissues can be infected by COVID-19. It does not cause disease because we're protected, but it nonetheless, our upper respiratory tract may get infected and allow virus to replicate And then when we cough and sneeze, we could be the source of spreading. So for the moment, the policy is get vaccinated and continue to wear a mask. Now, as we learn more, we may find out two things or three. First of all, we may find that this isn't such a big problem, and the extent of infectious and asymptomatic infection of vaccinees is very low. It could be. The second could be that even if you are infected, the level of viremia, or the number of viruses that you are spreading and shedding, is also very low because you're not developing a full-blown disease. And so it's not that dangerous. You're not an effective spreader. And then the third aspect is, and I would expect that if we find that there is concern of asymptomatic infection of people who are vaccinated, I'm sure there will be technologies, and you'll see at some point nasal sprays of vaccine in order to protect the mucosa of the upper respiratory tract, so that we will not have to be infected even so. And we've seen this before in the history of vaccines. We know that children who are infected with IPV, inactivated polio vaccine, Salk vaccine, have to at times resort to second vaccination with the oral polio vaccine, the Sabin, the live attenuated, in order to protect the mucosa, the linings of our gut. And so this is exactly the same situation. So I'm not terribly concerned. Will we have to wear masks for the duration of our lives? I doubt it. Will we have to wear masks for the coming near future? I propose we should. And during the course of the coming months, we will have a much better idea as to how to handle this situation. Will we return to our normal pre-coronavirus normal life? In my perspective, this is not my field, but as a citizen of the world, I believe we will not. We will come to a new equilibrium and a new harmony that is post-corona. We have experienced a trauma. We are all post-traumatic, and we will have to come up with some solutions and a new balance of how many times and how hard do I hug my friends. But we will come to some sort of a wholesome harmony, and I look for a much brighter future. And so we will overcome, and to quote Pete Seeger, if you will, and I expect that within the coming year, we'll begin to come out of the trauma and emerge with a new balance, which will probably be more cautious than we were previously.
Thank you very much, Professor. It was amazing, and it was a pleasure to have this discussion with you. I will leave you now for the second part in the hand of my colleague, Pascaline Wajman. Please, Pascaline, you have the floor.
Thank you, Aryeh. We have a lot of questions and only 20 minutes left, so we'll dive right into it. First question is from Jeff Donfeld. Jeff, if you would like to ask your question, go ahead.
Yes, Professor, what are the ethical considerations of providing the vaccine to undeveloped countries, either simultaneously with or prior to the vaccination of Western populations that can afford the vaccine?
Well, I think that you may be aware of the fact that the WHO and Gavi, another organization for vaccine development, have come up with a program called COVAX. And COVAX is a organization in which all the manufacturers in the Western world and the countries in the Western world have all contributed to make a supportive infrastructure to promise all countries in the world, third world or Western richer countries, at least coverage of 20%. Now, to be totally egocentric and totally selfish, it is in the world's best interest to have the world vaccinated. So the perspective of saying, let's protect ourselves because we can afford it, or we develop the technology. There are a number of reasons why we should see ourselves privileged and deserving of getting vaccinated before anybody else. That is almost an exercise in futility, because we're not totally isolated. And the virus doesn't know this. Viruses do not recognize neither wealth nor poverty, borders or otherwise, privileged or not. And so under these circumstances, I think it is the responsibility of the more developed countries to try to figure out how to provide vaccination to, if you will, the third world or the less privileged countries for our own benefit. Now, of course, there is a dynamics, and I can understand the situation where we're all seeking to get a hold of solid ground and be protected. But in the long run, if we look in the perspective of the coming year or two, the world needs to get vaccinated.
We have a question from Gary Lazar. Gary, if you would like to ask your question.
Yes, thanks. So the vaccine is obviously the holy grail, but the immediate need is treatment. Here in LA, we have one person dying every 10 minutes of the disease. So the question has to do with the work that's being done on repurposed drugs and what comments you may have about that. And if you may have seen that in the Times of Israel a couple of days ago was a report by an Israeli researcher regarding fenofibrate, which is a lipid-lowering drug, 30 years old, and its effect on the virus.
So there are two aspects in repurposing on the one hand, and biosimilars is another term that people use. This is very important. I would like to see novel drugs that have been designed purposefully for COVID-19, but until these become available, I agree completely. We need medications, we need the therapeutics, we need to be able to give care. I think we're learning, and I'm not a physician. I always like to stress it. I'm just a scientist. I have no background in medicine per se, and enormous respect for the medical community because they're doing an enormous job. And I think that the medical community has learned how to more effectively treat when to put on respirators or not. But you're absolutely right that repurposing existing drugs is important. I don't believe hydrochloroquine is what needs to be used. And the most developed novel drugs targeted for COVID-19 are all the new antibodies like in Regeneron and others, where monoclonal antibodies have been developed for the spike protein and have already proven to be effective. So we're going to see more of that. We need to see other existing drugs discovered as being effective at various aspects. One thing that we've learned through the disease is part of the pathogenesis, the development of the disease, is the cytokine storm. And so it's been important to subdue the immune response with dexamethasone, which is, again, a surprise if you look at the entire arsenal and toolbox of drugs that could exist. This is where I think a lot of effort needs to be done, and I look forward to seeing new developments.
Sam Pinto, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you. Other diseases, polio and AIDS, took 10, 20 years to disappear. Can we really think that in 1 year or something like that, maybe with half of the world not being vaccinated, COVID-19 can either disappear or be at least much less severe with these vaccines? Is it really possible, or it should take, and also because it will mutate, or it should take also 10 years or more to disappear?
So, you know, each virus has its dynamics. I don't want to debate with you, but I don't believe HIV, AIDS has disappeared. Polio, yes. AIDS, not. And it's a good example of these two dynamics. Polio is almost eradicated, which means that the existence of this virus in the human community has dropped markedly to sub-detectable levels in most communities around the world. So there are a few countries where there is residual polio, and the Gates Foundation and others are trying to actually clear and eradicate polio. SIDA, AIDS, is nowhere near that. The difference, however, is, and you are absolutely right, the difference is with AIDS, a huge impact on pharmaceuticals and medications. I began my career in the 70s, but I remember clearly the emergence of HIV/AIDS in June of '81, and I've been working on AIDS since '87. I was the head of the Israeli AIDS task force for a number of years, and this has been the focus of much of my research. And when AIDS emerged, the sense was viruses as opposed to bacteria. We don't have drugs for viruses. Antibiotics are good for bacteria, but for viruses, there were no examples. And as you know now, there is a very impressive set of antiviral drugs that are very effective in keeping the virus in check. And a number of people that were infected with HIV and presumed with a death sentence have gone on to live full lives because of the innovation. It goes to the previous question, can we develop effective therapeutics? Now, as to COVID-19, the situation is very different. I believe that the disease is not a devastating disease, even though the statistics are very bad for the moment. But generally speaking, I think it's a manageable disease. The problem is will we be able to eradicate it? And I think not, because diseases who have reservoirs of this virus in the animal kingdom and go on to infect people through zoonosis, the transfer of viruses from animals to humans, the reservoirs are always there. Polio does not have an animal reservoir. HIV, although it came from monkeys, from African greens or chimpanzees, again, this is not a massive zoonotic effect, but we've seen the zoonosis, the transfer of viruses from the animal kingdom in coronaviruses just within the last 20 years. This is the third event. We had SARS coronavirus in 2002-3, MERS coronavirus in 2012, and now SARS coronavirus 2. So we're not going to be able to eradicate coronaviruses. There are 7 coronaviruses that infect human beings. We need to be able to keep it in check. We need to develop vaccines, better therapeutics, and better treatment. And we will continue to live our lives like we live with many other viral infections. I don't see it as so much as a threat once we get it under control. Will we eradicate it? I doubt that very much.
Thank you. Thomas Newman, if you'd like to ask your question.
Yes, thank you. Can you tell us what the challenges are to get the immunity level in Israel to 60% and in the United States to 70%, other than the 60% of people you were talking about before? What are the other challenges to getting close to this, what we call herd immunity?
First and foremost is what we said. We need to educate, explain, reduce the anxiety. We have to get rid of the fake news. You know, I periodically write various pieces in the local Israeli social media. I don't have Facebook or Twitter or any of that, but here and there, I'm being asked to comment. And what I find academically amusing, but socially appalling, is the posts and the comments I get on whatever I honestly try to publicize and teach, share, and explain. People, for whatever reason, and I think this is part of social media, have become vicious and unrestricted and hide behind the fact that they don't have to reveal their identity and say anything they want. And unfortunately, this inflames and perpetrates and promotes yet more aggression. And I don't understand it. I'm not a psychologist. It's sometimes amazing to me what people write as a response to the honest explanations that I am providing, which I believe sincerely are correct. So I think we need to be far more open. We have to be far more compassionate and understanding and respectful for other people's opinions. And as I said, we want to incentivize and give incentives for those to go out there and get vaccinated. Maybe there will be restaurants that will say, oh, you know, if you're vaccinated, you can sit here. Oh, and that corner is for the unvaccinated. Now, you know, this is a pragmatic solution, but I think that is where we're going to have to go.
Thank you so much. We'll take one more question, and then I'll give the floor to Lee Rosenblum to close our event. We have a question from John Chapman. John, if you would like to.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Two questions in one, if you like. First of all, if you've had COVID, gone through that, and mutation arrives in your area, are you more open to getting the virus again in its new mutated form? And secondly, if you've had the vaccination and a new mutation develops, are you then liable to get the disease from the new mutation? Thank you.
The degree of genetic variation in viruses is at the crux of your question. COVID-19 and SARS coronavirus are quite stable, relatively stable viruses. Curiously, they've evolved with various enzymatic machinery to correct and stabilize their genetic composition. And so they do not accumulate mutations very effectively. Moreover, as less and less infections are ongoing, as infectious rate is reduced, that directly reduces the chances for more mutations. With all that being said, sporadic single mutations here and there within the protein of the spike, I do not believe should have such a profound damaging effect to the extent that you will not be protected. So there could be some marginal effects, but my sense is that with natural immunity, if you're infected and you've recovered, or with vaccination, there is going to be sufficient meat to the vaccine response that it can tolerate and deal with small variations. If I'm wrong, then the solution will be something along like what we see for a more dynamic virus such as flu. But as far as the biology of flu as compared to corona, these are two very different types of viruses.